They said, if you ruin tonight, don't come home. That was the last thing my brother hissed before straightening his cufflinks and walking ahead into the hotel's gold-lit lobby. It wasn't a joke. In my family, exile wasn't a metaphor. It was a sentence. And tonight, apparently, I was already on trial. The gala had the air of a cathedral, but without forgiveness. Crystal chandeliers spilled light over 100 round tables dressed in white linen, the kind of place where every smile was polished and every handshake had a price. I walked behind them like an afterthought, my press suit a size too small, the borrowed tie too stiff against my throat. Still I held my shoulders steady. In my inner jacket pocket, folded twice, was the only thing that had kept me from breaking under all the years of being the disappointment. 30 handwritten pages, ink smudged from late nights bent over a second-hand piano. My name had been scratched off the top corner. My own hand had done it months ago, when I thought maybe anonymity would make my family less ashamed of me. I didn't bring it tonight to offer. I brought it in case the night needed saving and the truth needed to be heard. I trailed them into the banquet hall, past the photographers. My mother smiled for the flashbulbs like she was being paid in gold coins. Her arm looped through my brother's. She glanced at me once, not a glance, really, more like a scan, and murmured to him, "Just make sure he sits on the aisle," less noticeable. The stage dominated the far end of the room, gleaming under spotlights. The city's finest orchestra was already warming up. A ripple of strings, a brass cough, a clarinet finding its note. From the program in my mother's hand, I saw the list of tonight's pieces: Tchaikovsky, Beethoven, Rachmaninoff. All grand, all safe. My work wasn't there. I'd never expected it to be. But when the conductor stepped briefly into the wings and our eyes met, something in his look told me the night might not go exactly as planned. And in that moment, I gripped the folded score in my pocket, feeling its weight like a secret I'd been carrying for years, one that could either save me or destroy me before the first note was even played. Friends, let's take a short pause. Write in the comments, where are you listening to this story from? Have you ever experienced something similar in your life? If you enjoy stories like this, make sure to subscribe and share this video. It truly helps us grow this channel and bring you more powerful stories. All right, let's continue. The program was a glossy sheet of thick paper, folded neatly and smelling faintly of expensive ink. My mother held it delicately between her fingers, as if touching it too firmly might smudge the prestige printed on it. The names marched down the page in confident serif font, composers long gone but immortal in marble halls and music history books: Tchaikovsky, Beethoven, Rachmaninoff. I knew every note of every piece they would play tonight. I had studied them not in concert halls, but in cramped kitchens and dim back rooms, where my practice drowned under the sound of dishes clattering or doors closing just before I could finish a phrase. My eyes scanned the page twice, maybe 3 times, knowing what I wouldn't find. There was no trace of the piece I had spent 3 winters writing, the music that had poured out of me during nights when the only warmth in the room came from the rhythm of my own heartbeat. It had been my attempt at leaving something permanent in a world that seemed eager to erase me. But here, in this perfect printed order of things, I didn't exist. I caught my reflection in the shine of the paper, eyes tired, jaw set, not surprised, but still wounded. I forced my lips into something close to a smile, because sometimes pretending is easier than explaining. My mother noticed the motion and, mistaking it for agreement, tapped the page lightly with her finger. "See?" she said, her voice full of the unshakable confidence of someone who believes the world already knows what's best. "Real music." I didn't answer. Words would have been too heavy for the moment, and besides, silence can sometimes be sharper than applause. So I let her believe I was admiring the program, while inside I was memorizing every space where my name could have been, every line where my work might have breathed. The lights above the stage were warm and golden, catching on the polished wood of the cellos and the brass of the trumpets. The orchestra tuned around us, weaving a tapestry of sound that made people shift in their seats in anticipation. I stayed still. My folded score was still in my pocket, the edges pressing against my ribs with each breath. And I thought, if tonight was going to belong to them, it would not be because I stayed silent. It would be because they didn't see me coming. I learned music in the shadows, in rooms where the only audience was the dust caught in the shaft of a street lamp outside the window. The piano had been bought second-hand from a widow who said it had been her husband's pride. Its ivory keys were yellowed and chipped, the wood nicked with decades of use. But to me, it was the most loyal thing I had ever known. It never asked where I had been, never judged my calloused hands, never flinched when I came home from the dishwashing job smelling of bleach and grease. Nights were my classroom. After the rest of the house surrendered to sleep, I would sit on the worn bench and lay my fingers against the cool keys. Midnight scales became my language, minor chords, my confessions. My hands would ache, skin splitting along the knuckles, fingertips raw from hours of pressing down until the strings inside rang out like something alive. There were times I practiced until my fingers bled, the small red stains on the keys a quiet signature no one else would ever see. I never had a conservatory. I never had a patron who smiled over champagne and whispered, "We'll make sure the world hears you." My teachers were the metronome that ticked like a stubborn heartbeat, and the silence of those who didn't think I would ever matter. Every shift in the restaurant, I washed away the stains of strangers' meals, counting beats in my head between the clatter of plates, imagining arpeggios in the sound of water against steel. And in those hours, bent over steaming sinks or hunched over the piano in the cold, I made myself a promise. One day I would play in a room where no one could turn away, where the sound would fill every corner and every ear. I didn't need my family to approve. I didn't need them to applaud. I only needed the truth to be louder than their forgetting. Now, sitting in that hall with the golden stage glowing just ahead, I could feel the same ache in my hands as I had on those nights, an ache not of weakness, but of something about to break free. And if tonight gave me the smallest crack of opportunity, I would push every note I had ever learned through it until the walls themselves remembered my name. They put me at the far end of the family row, the kind of seat you give someone you hope no one notices, close enough to be technically with us, far enough that in every photograph I would be half shadow, half absent. The table arrangement had been deliberate. My mother with her pearls in the center, my brother angled perfectly for the photographers, and me at the edge, a placeholder rather than a guest. From here I could see the stage better than their faces, and maybe that was a mercy. The small talk around me was thin and forgettable, words drifting past like paper boats that sink before reaching the shore. People leaned across me to speak to the person on the other side, barely breaking their sentences to acknowledge my presence. I answered when spoken to, my voice calm and steady, but my mind was elsewhere, already in the warm, resonant space of the stage, where the real language of the evening would be spoken. I studied the brass section as they settled into their seats, the gleam of the trumpets and trombones catching the light like captured fire. The players checked their slides and valves, lips pressing against mouthpieces with the tenderness of ritual. A French horn player adjusted her chair by a fraction of an inch, as if that sliver of comfort could be the difference between good and unforgettable. Then the oboe gave the A4, pure, unwavering. The sound seemed to slice the air in half, a signal that the night was about to step from conversation into truth. Around it the orchestra tuned, each instrument leaning into that single note like pilgrims toward a beacon. Strings hummed, woodwinds sighed, brass declared. To most in the audience, it was noise before the beauty, but to me, it was the first step of the story, a held breath before the leap. From the corner of my vision, I could see the family leaning toward each other, whispering, adjusting their posture for the perfect view. I didn't join them. My gaze stayed on the conductor's stand, empty for now, but soon to be filled by the person who would decide whose voice this night belonged to. And in my pocket, the folded score pressed against my ribs like a heartbeat, steady and waiting. If the moment came, I would be ready, not to stand in the center of the photograph, but to fill the entire room. My brother had a way of smiling that belonged in magazines, broad but calculated, generous yet rehearsed, the kind of smile that could close a deal before the contract was even on the table. I'd watched him wear it for years, polishing it until it gleamed, until no one could see the thin blade hidden underneath. Tonight, he wore it, as he strode toward the conductor, his steps easy, his suit cut perfectly to his frame, his voice carrying just far enough for the front rows to hear. They shook hands in the glow of the stage lights, the kind of handshake meant for photographs. "So honored you're featuring our foundation," my brother said, his tone threaded with charm and self-assurance. The conductor nodded politely, his eyes flicking briefly toward the wings, perhaps looking for someone else, perhaps only restless with the weight of the night ahead. My brother leaned in slightly, lowering his voice in a way that was somehow still designed to be overheard. "We did consider an original piece," he said, pausing just long enough to let the possibility hang in the air before letting it drop. "But we opted for proven." The word proven fell with the dull, muted clang of a cymbal struck without force, soft but sharp enough to cut if you knew the sound. It was the kind of word that didn't just reject you, it erased you. In that one syllable lived all the years of being told to wait, to watch, to know my place. Proven meant safe. Proven meant predictable. Proven meant that no matter what I had written, no matter how many nights I had bled over the keys, it would never be worth the risk of letting me be seen. The audience around us kept smiling, kept chatting, unaware that a small, quiet execution had just taken place at the edge of the stage. My brother turned back toward the family table, his perfect smile still intact, his shoulders squared as if he had just secured something valuable. In a way he had secured the narrative. The program would run exactly as planned. But he didn't notice the way the conductor's gaze lingered for a moment longer, scanning the crowd as though listening for a sound no one else could hear. He didn't see the conductor's fingers tap idly against his side, mimicking a rhythm that wasn't in tonight's program. And he certainly didn't see the way my hand brushed against the inside of my jacket, feeling the edges of the folded score. If proven was the safest choice, then tonight would remind them that safety and greatness rarely share the same stage. The score had been with me for so long it felt less like paper and more like a bone I had grown myself, something that had always been there under the skin, carrying the weight of my quiet defiance. 30 pages, handwritten in black ink that had faded to a dark brown where my fingers had lingered too long. The paper had softened over the years, edges worn from being folded and unfolded 100 times, each crease a scar from the nights I'd held it too tightly. I had written it in the hours when the rest of the house sank into the kind of silence that made you hear your own pulse. The only light came from a desk lamp whose shade tilted awkwardly to the side, casting a narrow circle of gold onto the blank staves. Outside, winter pressed against the glass, the cold seeping into my fingers until they stiffened. But still I played, still I wrote. Not because anyone was waiting for it, not because anyone would care, but because the music was the only thing that felt alive in a house where my presence was treated like background noise. The piece was not polite. It did not apologize for being born. It began with a quiet confession, a lone melody that seemed fragile enough to break under its own weight. But it grew, measure by measure, into something that would not bow its head. There were bars that clawed upward, key changes that refused to resolve neatly, movements that lifted like a prayer and then dropped without warning, because life had taught me that beauty and cruelty often arrived hand in hand. By the final page, the music stood on its feet, unshaken, the last chord stretched long enough to make the listener's chest ache. I hadn't brought it tonight to beg for a place in the program. I wasn't here to plead with anyone, least of all my family, for recognition. I had brought it for one reason only: truth. Truth has a way of finding cracks in the walls built to contain it, and if tonight, by some unplanned twist, truth was given the smallest sliver of an opening, I would be ready to let it through. My fingers rested on the folded manuscript inside my jacket, feeling the thickness of the stacked pages against my palm. It was heavier than paper should be, but that was because it carried more than notes. It carried the weight of every moment I had been told to stay quiet, every instance I had been passed over for someone proven, every silent night where the only applause came from the soft thud of my own heart keeping time. If the moment came, I would not walk toward it. I would run, and the sound they heard tonight would not be the safe, predictable music they expected. It would be the sound of a door finally breaking open. The green room smelled faintly of polish and old wood, a quiet refuge away from the chandeliers and murmurs of the audience. I had wandered back there under the pretense of getting a better look at the framed photographs of past performances, but truthfully, I just needed air that hadn't been filtered through the judgment of my family's table. That's when I heard it. My brother's voice, low but clear, drifting through the slightly open door at the far end of the room. His tone carried the same confidence it always did when he believed he had already won. "And I think it would be perfect for next season," he was saying. "It's something I've been working on for a while." Then, before I could even process the lie, I heard it. A melody hummed under his breath, casual and soft, as though it had always belonged to him. But it didn't. It was mine. Every note, every rise and fall, carved into my memory from the nights I had played it, until my hands ached. I had written it with the quiet desperation of someone building a ladder out of the dark, and now here it was, stolen and offered like a trophy from a hunt he had never taken part in. Through the gap in the door, I saw the conductor's expression shift. His brow furrowed, his head tilting slightly, as though he was trying to catch the edges of something he couldn't quite place. The man was no fool. He knew the language of music too well not to sense when a voice was borrowed. Still, my brother continued, weaving a story about inspiration and late-night work, about the discipline it took to craft something so moving. He even mimicked the rhythm with his fingers, tapping it against his leg in a clumsy imitation of my own habits. The conductor let him speak, but I could see the faint tightening of his jaw. When my brother finally stopped, expecting admiration, the maestro simply offered a polite nod and said, "I'll think about it." Then, without looking back, he excused himself, stepping out into the hallway with the kind of measured pace that told me his mind was already somewhere else. I turned my face toward the wall, hiding the heat rising in me. It wasn't just anger. It was the cold, cutting clarity of betrayal confirmed. I had known my family didn't believe in me, but I hadn't realized they would take what I had bled to create and pass it off as their own. I thought of the thin walls of our old house, the way sound carried in the stillness of night. My brother must have heard me, night after night, must have memorized the shape of my creation without ever once stepping inside to say a word. In my pocket, the real score felt heavier than it ever had, its weight now laced with something dangerous. This wasn't just about being invisible anymore. This was about reclaiming what had been stolen before the theft became history. And something in the way the conductor had looked, sharp, unsettled, told me the chance might come sooner than either of us expected. I had stepped out toward the service door for a moment, chasing the cooler air that seeped through the cracks. Out here, the noise of the gala was softened, reduced to a faint murmur behind the walls. The hum of the building was different in this corner, pipes groaning faintly, the buzz of an old light fixture, and somewhere far off, the muffled swell of the orchestra tuning. The sound was truest here, stripped of the echo and ceremony, pure enough to feel like it was touching the bone. That's where he found me. The conductor appeared without hurry, his polished shoes silent on the worn tile. His gaze went not to my face at first, but to the edge of the folded pages that peeked from the inside of my jacket, the corner of the manuscript pressing outward as if it had been waiting for this moment longer than I had. "Is it yours?" he asked, his voice quiet but firm, like a man asking not for information but for truth. I didn't speak right away. My fingers brushed the paper, feeling every crease, every scar in it. Then I met his eyes and gave a single nod. There was no point in pretending otherwise, not here, not with him. He reached forward, a slight hesitation before his fingers touched the score, as though the weight of it might shift something he couldn't undo. He unfolded it with the care of a man handling something sacred. His eyes moved quickly but deliberately over the bars, his brow relaxing, his breathing deepening. Then all at once his mouth parted, just a fraction, but enough to show the flicker of recognition, like someone who had been holding their breath far too long, and finally tasted oxygen again. He closed the pages slowly, as if reluctant to break the connection, then looked at me with something sharper than curiosity. "If I program it now," he said, "will you stand by it?" The question wasn't casual. It was a line drawn in the air between us. I understood the risk in it. My family, my brother, the donors, the meticulously printed program, it would all be upended. The safe, predictable evening would turn into something unpredictable, maybe even dangerous for him. And for me, it would mean stepping into a light I'd been denied for years, knowing it might burn as much as it revealed. "Yes," I said, the word felt like steel in my mouth, "even if I stand alone." He didn't smile. He didn't need to. He just gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, the kind of gesture that said the decision was already made. Then he tucked the score under his arm and turned back toward the stage, his steps faster now, as though the night itself had changed direction. And in that moment I knew it had. It happened in a corner of the stage most of the audience would never see. A narrow space behind the curtain where the lighting was dim, and the air smelled faintly of rosin and polished brass. The maestro stood with my score open on the stand, already marked with quick pencil notes, his eyes darting over the pages like a man reading a letter from someone he thought he had lost forever. "From the top," he said, not loud, but with the authority of someone who expected the world to obey. The strings began first, their bows drawing out the opening figure, a line of grief, but not the kind that drags itself into the ground. This grief climbed, stubbornly, each note stepping upward against the weight, trying to pull it down. The sound was raw, almost unpolished, but alive in a way that made my throat tighten. The timpani player leaned forward, sticks poised, listening intently to the way the cellos shaped their notes. Then came the soft, deliberate heartbeat, low, steady, insistent. It wasn't just rhythm, it was survival. Every strike felt like the moment you decide, quietly but without doubt, that you will not give in. The horns entered next, hesitant at first, as though they were stepping into a story they weren't sure they belonged in. But then the harmony found them, and courage followed. The sound broadened, the brass lifting the melody as if to say, "It's all right, you can stand now." And then the woodwinds, clear, aching, almost human, threaded their voices through the fabric of the piece. They didn't compete with the grief or the heartbeat or the courage. They answered them. They forgave them. The flutes carried the kind of light that only appears after a long winter, the kind that doesn't banish the cold but makes it bearable. The maestro listened to it all, his head slightly bowed, his left hand shaping the air like it was clay. When they reached the last measure of the section, he didn't immediately speak. He let the final note hang in the shadows, its echo fading into the soft shuffle of shoes and the muted creak of chairs. Then he lifted his baton again, his voice lower now, almost intimate. Again he said, "From the truth." And they played it again, not as practice, but as declaration. This time the grief was deeper, the heartbeat steadier, the courage stronger, the forgiveness more complete. I stood just out of sight, my hands clenched in my pockets, feeling every note like a pulse under my skin. It wasn't perfect yet, but it was real. And in a world built on proven, real was the most dangerous thing you could put on a stage. The house lights dimmed with the slow, deliberate fade that always feels like a held breath. The audience hushed in instinctive obedience, the last few conversations dropping into the dark as if swallowed whole. On stage, the conductor stepped forward, not with the leisurely air of a man following the program, but with the unshakable focus of someone about to alter it. He stood at the front, baton still at his side, and looked out over the hall. For a moment he said nothing, letting the silence build until it was no longer comfortable but necessary. Then his voice carried, calm and measured, the kind of voice that could steady a trembling hand. "Before our final scheduled piece," he began, "we wish to share a new work by a local composer." No name, no introduction, just an opening left wide enough for mystery to walk in and take a seat. The sound that moved through the hall was not applause, at least not yet. It was a murmur, soft but restless, like wind brushing over a field of wheat. People leaned toward each other, whispers blooming in the dark. A few faces turned to the program in confusion, flipping through the pages as if expecting to find a note they had somehow missed. Skepticism clung to some expressions. the kind that always comes when something unplanned dares to step into a space built for the expected. From my place at the far end of the family row, I could feel the shift, the way the air thickened with the quiet electricity of anticipation. My mother's posture stiffened. My brother's jaw tightened, the muscles working as he tried to keep his smile from slipping. They both scanned the stage, searching for a clue, for an explanation that fit neatly into the narrative they had built for the evening. None came. I kept my eyes forward, my hands resting on my knees to still the tremor building there. In my pocket, the absence of the score was as loud as its presence had been earlier. It was no longer mine to hold. It was on that stage now, in the hands of people who had touched its truth for the first time less than an hour ago. The conductor gave no further explanation. He simply turned back toward the orchestra, raised his baton, and let the silence stretch until it became the frame for whatever would come next. And in that space, between the announcement and the first note, I realized something. This was no longer about whether I was ready to be heard. It was about whether the room was ready to listen. And ready or not, they were about to. The baton came down, and the first chord struck like a door flung open in a storm. Sudden, fierce, undeniable. It wasn't the polite beginning of a program piece, the kind that eased the audience in with familiar pleasantries. This sound claimed the room in an instant, filling every shadowed corner, pressing into the lungs of everyone present. The opening motif was small at first, almost hesitant. A question asked in the language of half-belief. It wavered, as though unsure of its own right to exist, hovering between resolve and retreat. But before it could fade, the answer came. A line so clear, so defiant, it refused to bow. The two voices, doubt and defiance, took up the space like two figures circling each other, refusing to give ground. The string spoke in tight, restless phrases, the sound pulling against itself, as though memory itself were fighting to surface. Then came the dissonance, sharp and unyielding, like the moment betrayal stops being suspicion and becomes fact. The brass section did not soften it. They met it head on, blaring a response that didn't ask permission to be heard. It was justice in sound, unyielding, upright, refusing to stand down even when the clash threatened to break the walls apart. From where I sat, I could feel the pulse of the timpani through the soles of my shoes, each strike like the pounding of blood in my own ears. The woodwinds wove through the tension with threads of something fragile but unbroken, carrying the small human truth that still insisted on surviving between the blows. The music didn't comfort, it confronted. It told the truth the way truth always arrives, without apology. Halfway through, I stole a glance at my family. My mother, usually the picture of poised composure, sat rigid, her fingers curled too tightly around the clutch in her lap. My brother's smile was gone entirely, replaced by a stillness I had only ever seen when he was caught without an escape route. They weren't speaking. They weren't even moving, afraid perhaps that the slightest shift would shatter the spell and expose them to the eyes around them. The melody and counter-melody continued their struggle, each refusing to yield, but something had shifted. The defiance was growing, climbing over the doubt, pulling itself higher with each bar. And as the brass rose again, louder, prouder, the balance tipped. The music didn't just fill the hall, it stood up in it. And in that moment I realized this piece was no longer just mine. It was theirs too. The audience, the orchestra, even the people who had tried to silence it. Because once the truth stands, it makes a spine out of everyone who hears it. By the second movement, the air in the hall had changed. It wasn't just listening anymore. It was leaning forward, caught, unable to look away. The kind of focus you can't buy, the kind that can't be rehearsed. It was the kind that only happens when everyone senses, without being told, that something unrepeatable is happening in front of them. I felt the first ripple of movement beside me. My brother, usually so still in public, perfect posture, perfect expression, began fidgeting in small, jerky motions. His hand went to the program in his lap, flipping through the pages, scanning the printed lines again and again, like a gambler checking the losing ticket in disbelief. He turned it upside down once, as if the name might be hidden somewhere in the margins, as if reality could be rearranged if he just looked from the right angle. The name wasn't there. It never had been. And the silence where it should have been was almost louder than the music pouring from the stage. Finally, he leaned toward my mother, his voice low, but in the stillness of our row, I caught every word. "Who wrote this?" There was no curiosity in his tone, only the sharp edge of a man watching the ground shift under him. My mother didn't answer. She didn't even turn her head. Her eyes were locked on the stage, her face unreadable except for the tension in her jaw. Her clutch, always a delicate accessory in her hands, was now gripped so tightly her knuckles had blanched to bone white. She wasn't asking questions because she already knew the answer, and she knew that if she acknowledged it aloud, it would become permanent. The music didn't care about their panic. It kept moving forward, relentless in its truth. The violins climbed higher, lifting the theme until it arched over the hall like light breaking through stained glass. The brass answered, steady and immovable, as if standing guard over something that had been hidden too long. Even the percussion seemed to declare with every measured strike that no one at that table, no lie, no omission, could stop this story from being told now. I didn't look at them again. I didn't need to. The music was saying everything I had never been allowed to say, and it was saying it to everyone, all at once. They couldn't close the door on it. They couldn't talk over it. They couldn't turn the page to make it disappear. They were going to sit there in front of the entire city and hear every note of the truth they had tried so hard to bury. And there was nothing, absolutely nothing, they could do to stop it. The hall fell into a kind of suspended quiet, the kind that exists not in silence, but in the space between breaths. Then, from that stillness, a single violin emerged, its voice thin at first, almost trembling, as though unsure if it had permission to speak. The sound was fragile, but it didn't apologize for that fragility. It carried a defiance inside it, a quiet refusal to vanish, each note stepping forward like someone walking barefoot over broken glass. The cadenza unfolded without accompaniment, the violinist's bow barely grazing the strings, coaxing out tones so soft they felt more like memories than music. The melody climbed, faltered, then climbed again, bending under its own weight but never breaking. It was the sound of surviving by inches. And then the piano entered. Not in a flourish, not with grandeur, but with something smaller, simpler. 2 notes, steady and unmistakable. I knew them the moment they landed. They were mine, carved from one of the most private nights of my life. The lullaby I had written for my father on the night the machines in his hospital room went quiet. I had played it with my forehead resting against the piano lid, my fingers moving without sight, letting the sound hold me together when my body couldn't. The piece had never been meant for an audience. It was a prayer whispered into the dark, just for him. But here it was now, in front of hundreds, and yet instead of feeling exposed, I felt seen. Because the melody wasn't just mine anymore. The way it moved through the hall, you could hear the shift in the room, an almost imperceptible leaning forward, the way people do when something brushes against their own hidden memories. Those 2 notes weren't my father's alone. They belonged to every person who had ever sat in a quiet room and tried to keep love from slipping away. The piano and violin wove together, not perfectly, but humanly. The violin's line shook in places, as if remembering pain, while the piano answered with a steadiness that said, "I'm still here." The sound didn't grow louder, it grew closer, until it felt like the music was not coming from the stage, but from somewhere inside each listener's chest. I caught a glimpse of someone in the second row wiping at their face. In the balcony, a man closed his eyes, lips moving silently, maybe mouthing a name, maybe a prayer. And I thought, that's what this has always been about. Not credit, not reputation, but connection. The invisible thread between one heart and another, stretched across time and loss and sound. And in that moment I understood. The truth in music is not proven by who wrote it. It is proven by who feels it. And tonight the entire room did. The last chord did not so much end as dissolve, its resonance lingering in the rafters, clinging to the velvet curtains, refusing to leave the room. The sound hung there, weightless and unyielding, long enough for a person to live an entire life inside it, long enough to remember every night at the piano, every dismissal, every moment I thought the silence would win. And then, slowly, the echo faded, leaving only the thud of my own heartbeat in my ears. For a moment, no one moved. It was as if the hall itself needed a breath before it could return to the world of small noises and scattered clapping. Then the maestro, still holding his baton at his side, turned, not toward the donor's box, not toward the dignitaries in the front row, but directly toward the far aisle where I sat. His eyes didn't waver. "Composer?" he asked. Just that single word, but it carried the weight of an invitation and a challenge all at once. The air thickened, my family shifted in their seats. My mother's hand went to her pearls as if to steady herself. My brother's lips pressed into a thin line that failed to hide the color draining from his face. They knew, and worse, they knew everyone else was about to know too. I rose slowly, not with the triumphant rush of someone claiming a prize, but with the steadiness of a man stepping into the place he was always meant to stand. Chairs creaked as heads turned. Eyes found me, and in their expressions was the spark of recognition, the quiet satisfaction of a mystery solved. And then it happened. The hall began to rise, not all at once, but in waves. One row, then another, until the entire audience was on its feet, their applause crashing like surf against the walls. It wasn't polite clapping. It was the kind that lifts a person off the ground, the kind that says we saw it. We felt it, and now it belongs to all of us. I didn't bow. I didn't need to. I simply met the conductor's gaze, and he nodded once, the faintest smile at the corner of his mouth. It was a look that said, "They can't take this from you now." I glanced at my family only briefly. My mother's face was unreadable, as if she was holding together the last pieces of a story she had told herself for years. My brother looked down at the program in his lap, its empty credit line suddenly louder than anything else in the room. And above it all, the roar of the audience kept rising, wave after wave, until it drowned out every lie, every slight, every moment I'd been told to sit quietly on the aisle. For the first time, the sound belonged to me, and I didn't have to prove it to anyone. When the lights came up and the crowd finally began to thin, the sound of their applause still lingered in the air, not as an echo, but as a presence, something living that followed me into the quiet. I stepped into the side corridor near the stage door, where the air smelled faintly of wood and brass polish, and that's where my brother found me. His steps were hesitant, his usual perfect stride broken into uneven pieces. He opened his mouth, and for a moment nothing came out. Then, finally, words, clumsy, halting, stripped of their usual polish. I didn't know it would. I shouldn't have. The sentences never fully formed. It wasn't an apology in the way people imagine them, clean and deliberate. It was a thing still learning how to be born, heavy with the weight of years when he had never imagined needing to say such words to me. I didn't answer. Not because I wanted to punish him, but because, sometimes, silence is the only language that can hold what's too big for words. The conductor appeared a moment later, and when he shook my hand, it was with the grip of a man who knew exactly what he was honoring. "We'll open next season with your work, under your name," he said. No flourish, no speech, just truth stated plainly, like it had always been meant to be that way. There was talk of a plaque for the hall, a permanent place where visitors could see the name that had been missing from tonight's program. A commission was signed on the spot for a new piece, as if the ink couldn't wait for tomorrow. But those promises, generous as they were, felt almost secondary to what had already happened, because the real verdict was in the city itself. Outside, as people spilled into the streets, I could hear it. Snatches of the melody, hummed unconsciously, carried like warmth in their breath. Strangers walking home under the winter night sky were taking pieces of it with them, and in that way the music was already becoming something larger than me. It no longer belonged only to the man who had written it. It belonged to the city. I stepped out into the cool air without triumph in my stride. There was no need for the swelling pride of a man claiming a victory. What I carried instead was something quieter, steadier, peace. Not because they had finally heard me, but because I had finally let the music speak for itself. And in the end, it had said everything that needed to be said. Louder, truer, and more beautifully than I ever could.